and it's very nice to see familiar faces and new faces. I know some of you are veterans of the battles we have had to try to keep the right to make policy and regulation about services within our national and sometimes regional control. And there has been concerted efforts now for many years to develop international rules that would enable foreign corporations not only to be able to enter as foreign investors, or more recently, unrestricted delivery of services from across the border on at least as neutral a basis as locals. That means no preferences and protections for local service suppliers, but also increasingly moves to restrict how governments can regulate services in other ways, such as licensing of those who deliver services, or the kind of technical standards that need to apply to services, whether it's your postal service or your education service or your health service. The way that regulations are administered to take away discretion from those who are applying criteria to what a service has to be like, and who can deliver it and how. And the more there have been attempts to put what they call disciplines on the domestic regulation of services, the bigger the fight has been inside the WTO, because many of the developing countries have said that's enough. We are not going to have you going further and further into our domestic sovereign authority to decide how we operate our services. And so the attempt to get those disciplines on domestic regulation have been going since 1995, since WTO was created, and not managed to go anywhere. In addition, of course, there were attempts to make the services agreement cover more services, so more restrictions on regulating foreign investors coming into the country, the number and size of them, restricting the areas, geographical and service areas they could go into. And those negotiations, which Norway activists were very strong in resisting, have also not gone anywhere. Those negotiations were launched in 2000, and they have not gone anywhere either. So to that extent, we and some allies in developing countries have been very effective in keeping control of services within, at least within the sphere of governments that we can exercise some influence on. And Norway, of course, was part of another aggressive move called the Trade and Services Agreement, or TISA, that was trying to achieve that outside the World Trade Organization. And we managed to help defeat that as well. But what we are seeing now is another wave of attempts to get global pro-corporate regulation through the avenue of services. And if we just do a little side trip and we think about how almost everything now is a service. even agriculture or mining or manufacturing, they are all operated now through services operations, whether it's the digital and computerized services operations or the entire supply chain. So the commodity of the agricultural product or the mineral is a part of the old trade arena, and services, or what we call servicification of the economy, is the big new world. And so it's the Trojan horse through which to try to make the new global trade rules. And so I just want to bring briefly to your attention 3 developments that are happening now that I think signal a major new offensive that we're going to need to work out how we strategize internationally and domestically to deal with. And I'm going to kind of go in reverse order and deal with domestic regulation last. In the middle of 2018, 4 countries, including New Zealand, put forward the idea that we should have a new round of GATS negotiations to put more of each country's services under the rules of the agreement. And they said when this agreement was first set up in 1995, it was supposed to have new negotiations every 5 years. And the first lot of 5 years negotiations have never been. So we think, they said in mid-2018, we should start them again now. And there wasn't much enthusiasm. But what has happened this year is that 4 new proposals have been tabled with requests to discuss negotiating new commitments of these services sectors to the rules that say you can't give preferences to locals, you can't restrict foreign companies, you can't limit the size of the big services, multinationals, and so on. The first of those new areas is environmental services. And that covers a range of services of engineering, architecture, construction, which might sound boring, but construction includes all the water-related and sewage-related construction, the distribution services related to environmental services, which may include, from what I can see, issues like packaging, data processing, which is, of course, how so much of the environmental services now are being run through the digital technologies and data, and consulting services. Right? So there is a push to get more pro-multinational rules around environmental services. The second area, which may not be a boom time given COVID, is tourism-related services. But tourism-related services is a very, very big catchment. It goes from your cruise ships and your hotels and your restaurants through to your tour guides and your local markets where your people sell stuff, through to all of the input services into tourism operations and so on. So it's potentially very big. The third proposal, which has just gone up, is on agriculture-related services. So think of the big agribusinesses and the big food industry businesses who are wanting to remove restrictions on their operations. So that is all services incidental to agriculture, which is the whole supply chain of how the farming systems operate. Wholesale trade in live animals, which you might have seen, there was a ship that sunk recently on its way to China with loss of quite a few human lives, but also about 700 livestock who were on their way to China. Selling by contract food products, which is basically the whole of the Amazon Prime kind of, because they sell through contractual relations, wholesale trade in food and beverage, and food retailing, which is all the supermarkets and so on. So there is a big push now to get countries to agree not to restrict them. And the fourth of the papers that's gone up is on logistics, which is the whole of the logistics supply chains, and that proposals come from China. And if we look in just in the COVID context, and we're looking at the supply chains and the dominance of certain suppliers in those supply chains, we can see the issues of vulnerability around that. So that is one of the three fronts on which there is an attempt to now push the new global rules in relation to services. And these were, I think, discussed, they were to be discussed at the council that's responsible for trade and services in October, but I haven't heard whether that meeting went ahead, who was there, because Geneva's now got big restrictions again on meetings, and what happened. So the second big offensive on services is in the breakaway negotiations on electronic commerce. Some of you may be aware of this, but you all know how the digital age is now the big boom, and is whoever controls the data and whoever controls the digital technologies and ecosystem controls most things. And certainly when we're talking about international services, because so much of it now is operated through the digital frameworks. And there was an attempt to get some negotiations approved for this at the last meeting of the WTO ministers in the end of 2017, and the developing countries stopped that. But a breakaway group, which includes Norway, said they were going to negotiate anyway. And they have been doing that, and they produced in August what they call a stock take text of all of the proposals on the table and the different proposals within those proposals from different countries. And one of the parts of that text, which they want to get adopted at the next ministerial meeting, but we don't know when that will be, has a proposed new schedule for countries to adopt in the GATS. So a whole new set of commitments countries would adopt on these rules, not to restrict foreign companies coming in, not to privilege your local companies, not to restrict their size, and so on. And this new schedule basically says countries will not have any limitations in the areas of all computer and related services, which means all the big tech players can do whatever they like. Advertising services, which is clearly all of the Google, Facebook, or all of the big digital advertising, including the user-generated advertising. Technical testing, which is how so much of the systems from mining to agriculture to water and electricity and utilities is done. Courier services, which is linked to postal services. Wholesale and retail distribution services, which is all of the shops and all of the distribution sectors. Maritime, railroad and multimodal transport, so the entire transportation networks. And payments, transmission and credit card services. So that covers a fair amount in the name of electronic commerce. So that is the second front, and that is happening in secret. And the third front is this development of disciplines on domestic regulation of services. And what they're trying to do is mainly three things. The first is they want to make sure that when countries are proposing new regulation of services, before they adopt it, they put out the proposals with enough information to allow foreign states and foreign companies to see whether those new regulations will affect them, and then to have a say in the policy-making process that countries use to adopt them. And that is in the ironic name of transparency. So all of this stuff takes place in secret, but it's to be transparent for the corporate interest. The second thing that they're wanting to do is to make sure that when decisions are made to authorize foreign firms to supply a service, that the decisions are made on what are called objective and transparent criteria. That means things like, do you meet the quality standards? Do you have the skilled personnel to do this? So none of the qualitative factors that you might want to bring into bear as to whether you're going to authorize foreign firms to deliver a service, like what has their track record been in other countries in terms of non-compliance with rules? Yeah. Or we see this as a particularly sensitive area in Norway, and so we want to impose additional restrictions on the way that this is regulated when it's foreign companies, especially if the foreign companies are delivering service from outside the country, and we're not able to hold them to account in the way that we would if they were here. So that's a second goal. And a third goal is that in administering regulations, they are to be administered in a reasonable, objective, and impartial way. So if your regulators are asking for lots of information so they can assess compliance, are they administering it in a reasonable way? And you can imagine reasonableness is a very big empty box into which lots of things can be put. So one of the disputes that they've been having over this is the US wanted those last rules in particular to apply to all services, whether or not a country had committed those services to the other rules. And the other countries said no, they wanted to be able to exercise some control over whether that reasonable administration, etc., applied to everything or only to some services, and which services. So the compromise has been that it will be to services that countries list in a third column of their schedule, called additional commitments, but that they would add to their schedules. And what has happened in the last 5 months is that the countries involved in this, including Norway, have been submitting schedules of additional commitments to these domestic regulation domestic regulation rules. Now, those who have memories of these campaigns before, we had big campaigns to force governments to show what they were doing. And my government has actually given me the schedule for New Zealand, and I think they gave it to me because they have only added one small thing. But we don't know whether other countries have done that or have done more. But there is a principle at stake anyway, which is the secrecy of imposing additional restrictions on what domestic polities are able to do. And so those three elements, if we take them together, look like a pretty concerted backdoor route to starting up a whole new GATS negotiation, to do it as rapidly as possible and to do it by stealth. So that's what I wanted to share with you.
Thank you very, very much, Jane.